Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I'm going to be talking about Rise of the Dungeon Master, Gary Gygax, and the creation of Dungeons and Dragons. It was written by David Kushner, and it was drawn by Koresh Shadmi. Okay? Now, this is a graphic novel that recently came out. I read it from cover to cover, and actually, this is not a review of me talking about this book. And the reason why is I don't really look at this book from the perspective of art. It certainly has art in it, and I don't look at it as perspective of a story, right? This is essentially, this is part of the historical record of Gary Gygax, and I take that incredibly seriously. And the reason why is I have a really unique view on Dungeons and Dragons. Not a lot of people have been talking about Dungeons and Dragons in this way, but it's important to me, and I want to be very clear about, I'm going to be talking about Rise of the Dungeon Master for a while, and I just want to make sure that my bias is known. Okay, so basically, here's what I believe about Dungeons and Dragons, and Gary Gygax specifically, really about Gary Gygax. So I believe that Dungeons & Dragons is right now, in today's time in history, is really exactly like Marvel in the 1980s. In the 1980s, Marvel almost went out of business and had to sell parts of their company in order to retain, in order to stay afloat, right? And that's why one of the reasons why we have all these movie problems now with different people owning different parts of Marvel, right? Nobody knew the value of Marvel. Today, the value of Marvel is absolutely known, and it is multi-billion-dollar property. I believe, okay, now right now, Dungeons and Dragons is in the tabletop role-playing game industry, is the genesis of the tabletop role-playing game industry. It costs $35, and that last year, ICV2, which is a source that tracks money made off of different games, is saying that the entire tabletop role-playing game industry is $35 million a year business, which is incredibly small. It is a niche industry. And there are lots of people who are playing Dungeons & Dragons, and Dungeons & Dragons is selling very, very well right now. It's not near its peak, which was the 90s. But my supposition is that all this is wrong. Nobody really knows the real value of Dungeons & Dragons today, right? And the reason why is the failure of being able to deliver Dungeons & Dragons as a film. I think it's going to be just like Marvel, where once Dungeons & Dragons establishes itself as a successful film, it could be easily a multi-billion-dollar property. And when that happens, a lot of people that are ignoring Dungeons & Dragons as the first Genesis tabletop role-playing game, or that look at it sideways, are going to understand that it is the genesis of virtually every single, I would say 75% of everything that's in video games comes straight out of Dungeons & Dragons, right? And video games are probably the most iconic, most influential element of cultural significance today in America. Nothing comes even close, right? And the reason why is, in my opinion, I know there are many women who play video games, but many people believe that the majority of purchasers for video games, it affects right now, video games affect male culture in a way that they don't affect female culture yet. Okay, that is changing, but right now, and because of that, video games are very important to American society, and people really have not made the connection between video games and Dungeons and Dragons. There are absolutely people who get it, and there are people who are actually being very, very carefully acknowledging this. But the reality is, the significance of Dungeons and Dragons within American culture really is not understood today. It is a multi-billion-dollar property in disguise, right? And there's going to come a day where people realize it, just like they realized it with Marvel, right? And and so we're in the fallow period right now. We're in the period where people don't understand the significance of Dungeons and Dragons, right? So just wanted to kind of get that out there and explain that. So what does that mean? Well, that means that I don't think people really have grasped what's happening with Gary Gygax, or what his life really meant, or what was happening within Gary Gygax's life. So here's some of the things. So I read this book cover to cover, and honestly, I will say, I think there's some value in this book because you could sit down and you could see the shape of Gary Gygax's life very well by reading this book as far as the overall shape and the big events. But I have major problems with this book because it leaves out critical aspects completely. And what really frustrates me is it's leaving these things out, right? But when you're leaving it out, it's you're kind of like, why are these? It's very clear that David Kushner knew about what I was about to say and ignored it and left it out. And when you're doing that, you are telling a story. So are you telling the historical record of what happened? Or are you doing a fluff piece? Well, in my opinion, at the end of the day, I think this is a fluff piece. And the reason why is it's not really telling the whole truth about Gary Gygax. And I feel like he is an important historical American figure. And to choose to leave certain things out is irresponsible, because we are shaping right now what his legacy will be, right? And there are people who are debating over what the true source of Dungeons & Dragons is, how it actually came forward, what part Gary Gygax played. I absolutely believe he's the father of Dungeons & Dragons, without a doubt. And, I want to be super clear about that. But here's the issue, right? So this book has all the major touch points. It's hard for me to even, talk about this book because I've read many books about the life of Gary. I've read several books. There aren't many. But I've read virtually every book I can get a hold of that talks about the life of Gary Gygax. And so when I read a new one, all that really happens is me saying, what did they put in? What did they put out? What is their take on the record, right? Well, one of the things that was taken out of this is that when Gary Gygax was 7 years old, he lived in Chicago, right? And he was involved with a young group of men named Kenmore Pirates, a young group of boys named the Kenmore Pirates. Wikipedia talks about this, and the term they use for that group of boys is gang. When Gary Gygax was 7 years old, in Wikipedia right now, they use the term fracas. There was a fracas in Chicago, right, with the Kenmore Pirates and another group of young men, another group of boys, specifically boys, right? Well, if we're talking about a group of boys from Compton and there's a conflict, and they use this term right in Wikipedia, the term is gang, right? So there was Gary Gygax, when he was 7 years old, was involved with a gang, and there was a fracas, that's the exact term used in Wikipedia right now, that occurred, that was so significant that Gary Gygax's father, he was a musician, specifically a violinist, uprooted them from the city and moved to Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Okay, that means that there was an event that happened, a fracas, right? And I will tell you right now, I think there's a lot of weight in that word fracas. I don't think it was a fracas, right? Because I think the same event in Compton would get a different name, and I have a problem with that, right? Gary Gygax is an American historical figure, and we need to start wrapping his life in truth. We need to start just accepting the truths about it, right? And for me, when you study Dungeons & Dragons and you study Gary Gygax's life in depth, right, you need to be fair to all cultures, including his. Gary Gygax was, at 7 years old, was involved in an event with a group of boys, the Kenmore Pirates, in Chicago, right near Wrigley Stadium, Wrigley Field, that was so significant that it made his father uproot him and move him to a new town, a suburb, away from the city, a cultural center, right? Which is there's a lot there, right? It's not even mentioned in the book, right? It's not explained, right? Well, why is it important that you explain this? Well, here's why, right? Dungeons & Dragons was birthed from a war game, from war games. Dungeons & Dragons spends more time talking about combat than every other subject combined, right? Which means that it is critical and crucial to the history of Gary Gygax. Gary Gygax was involved at the age of 7 with a group of young boys who had a fracas so significant that it made his father uproot their entire family from the city and move to the suburbs, right? This isn't explained in the books. It's washed over, right? That is revisionism, in my opinion. And I was very disappointed to see it in this story. And it is my opinion that Rise of the Dungeon Master displays revisionism in it. Now, it is not a work without merit. I really enjoyed reading it. But I was upset to see this revisionism, right? It's important that we understand who Gary is and we do not look away from it, right? And that we also treat all cultures the same, right? I really, I study, I'm a huge fan of hip hop, right? And those, the same event, right? It happens in Compton. It's not called a fracas, right? And that's, we don't get to rewrite like that. We don't get to do revisionism. It's important that we accept who our heroes are fully, right? And I will say this right now, Gary Gygax is a hero for me. He delivered the game that has meant more. There's only one book in the world that means more than the PHB, the DMG, and the MM to me. Those books are precious to me. I have, editions. I have all three of those books, editions 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and I will have every edition on my shelf until I die. I am ride or die Dungeons and Dragons, right? And Gary Gygax is the father of that. He is a hero to me, but I don't think it's fair to paint his life and hide the parts we don't like, right? I think Gary Gygax struggled with some problems when he was young, and I think, and if you're telling a story of his life, you don't just sweep that aside. You don't color that, right? It's just not fair. It's not fair to him, and I just don't. It's really not fair. So with all that said, I just think it was really important to acknowledge that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about it. One of the things that it did do that I was really impressed with is, and I had seen this, I'd done some reading on this as well, Gary Gygax got religious near the end of his life. There was actually somebody who was connected to the game, started talking about him, specifically Christianity, and that's a huge topic that is, was Gary Gygax a Christian? Well, what does that mean for the game? And we also know that he came to that later in his life, right? So they breached that subject, and I think there's still a lot of research to be done on that subject specifically. But I really like that was breached. I did enjoy this, and I will say another thing is, this story is really probably one of the most important books ever written about Gary Gygax because it is a graphic novel. By taking what would be very dry material and putting it into a visual structure, it made this much more accessible to a lot of people, right? But I think it's really important that we, as students of Gary Gygax's life, acknowledge, this fracas, and it's a big part of his life, and I think it's one of the reasons why Dungeons and Dragons as a game has the shape that it has, because it is top heavy with combat. It is truly top heavy with combat, and I invite anyone to contest that point, right? And I think we're dealing with a tabletop role-playing game industry is dealing with that problem right now, right? Like, the reality is, the more I look at tabletop role-playing games, there's a myopic focus on combat, and combat really shouldn't be dealt with any differently than any other task within the game, right? And we have never had a tabletop role-playing game that truly embraces that fully, in my opinion, and has the same resolution for if you're going to jump a horse over a crevice as it would, if you're going to take an axe and hit somebody who's holding a shield, right? You just don't. There's never been a game that deals with both of those tasks in the same way, and I think that comes from its genesis, and that comes from what was really in Gary Gygax's heart throughout his life, and that is shown through his actions in his life and the events that happened in his life. And so, I think we really need to be very careful about revisionism, and I do think that the Rise of the Dungeon Master is some revisionism. Now, to my knowledge, this is basically they took an article that he wrote for Wired and converted it into this specific item, and so I really think it was important to really acknowledge that. And I was, that part being in there, because I think there's really no good reason for that part to be omitted. And, and especially if you're looking at the whole of his life. Another thing that this book did was it talked about Dave Arneson. There's major debate on how much was Dave Arneson a part of the creation of Dungeons & Dragons. And it did a really good job. This book did do a good job of showing that Dave Arneson was engaged by Gary Gygax. This was my takeaway from the book. After I read it, this is what I feel the book was saying about Dave Arneson. So they were saying that Dave Arneson, who's often credited as a co-creator of Dungeons and Dragons, the book was saying that Gary Gygax, created the idea for Dungeons and Dragons, brought in Dave Arneson, and they spent months on the telephone hammering it out. They had no hard contract, from what it looked like, for how his work was going to be credited. And then they began selling it. And I think Gary Gygax wanted him as a contributor, like game by Gary Gygax, and then, some concepts, like concept lead or whatever on the bottom would be Dave Arneson. But I don't think Gary Gygax ever wanted Dave Arneson to be credited as a co-creator of Dungeons and Dragons. I agree with Gary Gygax. I don't think he was a co-creator of. I think he brought some ideas to the table, and I don't think that makes you a co-creator. So I do not really believe that Dave Arneson is one of the fathers of Dungeons and Dragons. I think he's somebody who knew the father of Dungeons and Dragons and talked to the father of Dungeons and Dragons. And I truly believe the father of Dungeons and Dragons is Gary Gygax. So one, I just want to acknowledge. It seems I'm a little wound up on this. I am. So I will acknowledge that. In that, I was a little, when I came to this book, I feel bad for David Kushner because, well, that's just it. I think a lot of people are like, oh, let's talk about Gary Gygax's life, and they're like, it's just a game, and we could just we could present it any way we want, and I don't think that's the case. I think Dungeons and Dragons is part of Americana. And I think this history is American history. This isn't the history of Dungeons and Dragons. This isn't the history of Gary Gygax. This is the history of America, right? And as Americans, we own the greatest achievements of our country. And I truly believe Dungeons and Dragons is an unbelievably great accomplishment. And it's part of Americana. And so I think that absolute driven work should be done to get to the truth of what the core of Gary Gygax's life was and what the core of the creation of Dungeons & Dragons was. Thank you.